project anyway. So we have started diving into an overview of both the kind of different structures that we have created, but also different perspectives on the structures, and for framing for this, I should share the screen, which I will do right now. And we have just gone through Shift engine and Imagus engine, which means that whoever is listening to or watching this has to a little bit jump into the action, but them's the breaks. Let's go on for that. But that's the direction of the Shift engine and the Imagus engine.
It seems interesting to me that I see at least the Imagus engine clearer, but that it is capable of both generating new images, but also analyzing or dissecting images that are already there. Like the generator can either create something new or contextualize something else. And I see those as very distinct forms of using the same engine.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have thoughts around that.
It's intentional. So it's perceptive of you pointing that out, because it's been kind of like almost like a design principle in that. And this is also because it started from this nature of like I wanted an analytic for Tarot, but also kind of like designer. Like that's why I called it the analytic also in the beginning, because that's the more the one side of things, and the designer is the other side of things. That and it's related to the fact that you kind of benefit from having both perspectives, from especially in something like a context of tarot, but of course this would replicate in the context of gems and gem-like things. Is that like you might want to start with an image, and much of what you do is first analytic, like you're kind of breaking it apart by interpreting it. But then you might want to turn that analytic into expression and say, now I titled this. But you often get that material by analytics. So it's almost like the generation highly benefits from there being an analytic engine. And you're right that is a difference between Shift engine, which is more like, okay, let's take a context like a scene, like what kind of things we could bring into, like if a group of people have to generate in like pieces things into it, because it's easier than generating wholesale something, like what kind of things would become considerations and possibilities there.
What I really like those, like they are kind of, they explain themselves quite well already without any further clarification, and at least when for those who have seen the previous sessions, and I really like that they are foremost kind of, for me they are language in a sense that that they kind of they are kind of suggestions for agreements on how we should approach some affordances or capabilities, and so on. So meaning, for instance, that and we can even if you can apply them to, let's say, the Arc dungeon, we can also like apply them to whatever, whenever we want, even if we are like having a discussion now, we then know that, okay, or we can, it comes to mind that, okay, I will add this or shift this or cut this or so on, and then we immediately understand what it is about. One thing I was thinking about the cut feature, should there also be some sort of copy or duplication or something similar?
There could be, like, definitely these are addable, like there's no like exhaustive list. Let's put it as a, like I often do this way, which is you don't have to copy this style, but like I put question marks at the front
Yeah.
of the line to create like, oh, this is consideration. I wish
Yeah.
that bullet point list could have a possibility of having question marks as bullets, because that would be so useful. Um, but yeah, these are definitely addable. Like they and I really agree with you with like in this sense, as you were saying, that they're kind of like a language. But I put the note on that they are bridging between what is language and what is the nature of mechanics, like game mechanics here, like that in a way, like you can approach it as mechanics, like in the XORG, how they were expressed, the shift engine was very much kind of like just emphasizing their mechanicness by saying, okay, you have these moves, and then this is the description of how you do the moves. And now that they're more mechanical, but underneath there is the sense that it's kind of like starting from language or concepts, but then like looking at them from the perspectives of like how they can become mechanics, which I think is a very flexible and kind of powerful field. Not the only field, but certainly a powerful field in itself. I forgot to add one, which should be here. I'll just add it quickly, which is the, I knew I forgot something. And this is the approach we used, not the last, but the session before, like, which is actually included in this document, the rules of it. So I won't replicate them here, or at least the kind of guidelines of it. Yeah. But yeah, like maybe one word about this: why these three? Why the lines between them? And what are these different things doing? Like the first thing to say that the arrows are pointing at that there's a huge amount of overlap, and it's not like one has to kind of separate these things. Actually, the overlap is, it's like really like three different perspectives. Like there are different facets on a gemstone, like, and you can kind of turn it, but they kind of bleed into each other. But what they kind of point out, like for example, say like a game structure, like an arc or is very much a generator in itself. But it was interesting for me to think about generators almost like more modularly. As like, okay, what kind of things we can use to like take this situation which is a really repeating situation, that you create an interesting contour of something like a scene or a project or whatever. Like, how do you generate things into it, and what kind of things you can use for that? So having something like a development direction of such a generator is, I think, a potentially useful thing. So that's why I separated the generators here. But structure is like, of course, OBOK is there as the first one, partly because it's very much about the kind of like, okay, let's put this into these kind of areas kind of thing. Like we have this like a complexity that is an organization or a game. Like here's a way to see it in pieces, and like artwork is slightly more game-like, or like OBOK is more like a meta structure for potential games, and artwork is more like already kind of game itself. Gems is once again more like a meta structuring. But what I meant by structures is really like, okay, let's go to high-level overview and see this sort of like an overlay, and like let's see this area and that area and this area. And while that can be a generator, it's a useful perspective in itself. So I wanted to kind of populate that perspective. And then the paradigms / principles is like there are these concepts or that have their own particular meanings that are part of the lingo of XORG. Like the way we talk about things like rights or affordances, capabilities, capacities, but also including more particular cases like moves, could be power skills, is like related to common understanding, but also somewhat different. Same goes for roles. And then this possible realm semi-averse, which like the genes and what kind of structures that could create is an example of that, is not really a common concept. Also the capturing / saving we've talked about, it's related to the common sense, but it's not. Then offers, tokens, actual / potential. So with these paradigms and principles, it's like if one would take like concepts that you would like to explain to people as like these are really good to know beforehand in this particular sense, and seeing the kind of potentialities they open. That's what I mean by paradigms. Like the rights paradigm or roles paradigm goes to many of these things, many structures, etc. And that is useful to have that sense of a difference to the normal to explain the possibilities these paradigms open. So that's the general overview.
Do you consider the paradigms principles to be like an underlying the rest of the structures and the rest of the examples, or like in terms of layers, do you see them as more primitive?
It's possible to see them that way. I almost see them as like common elements. Like they would be these modules, but they would appear all over. Like you go to this structure, I know you see the roles, or in this particular sense again, and you go to another one and you see that same behavior even under a different name. So it's like almost like common elements, Lego blocks in this sense, like, or particular types of Lego blocks. I'm trying to think other metaphors. There could be something in cooking, but
like common patterns, maybe.
Yeah, cutting.
Mm.
Yeah, like common patterns. Yeah, like let's put that. That's a good way of thinking about it. I'm putting, and while encouraging also others to write, I'm making this sort of, what could you call it, common comment area. But maybe the like one comment more on the like, okay, this is just the overview. It's not yet general mechanics, but I think from here you can see, like, let's imagine that you had this let's imagine it as a document. Maybe that makes it easier to understand. And in the beginning, there would be this sort of like explanation of these paradigms. Like, okay, this is a common pattern you see. Like it's rights, but it's a different kind of sense of rights, and it reflects in different things, like how the moves are approached and things like this, and same with the roles, and then for structures like explanation towards the semi-verse, by the way, which I've started drafting on. So these would be kind of explained in the beginning, and then you would have like okay, here is like a general structure, like almost like a template to lay upon a thing like organization, and you could use OBOK or ARCORG or something completely different, but you're looking at it as like, okay, we set this as like a framework, really. Let's put that as a term, I think, is maybe a good let's put frame workers, which sounds funny enough to me, but I have a bad humor anyway. So, but it's sort of that they are active, like frame workers in that sense. And then the generators is more like they are constantly present, but a little bit of a new perspective is like, okay, if you have this framework, and the framework provides you kind of like slots, but you might apply different generators to fill them in, and it's just as much about the styles of generators as it is of a particular generator, like this kind of style of generator works for this kind of thing, and so on. Like, I think already when you were pointing out, Pablo, this difference between the imagus and shift, it's really about this sort of like that they serve different purposes. But one could put here, and probably maybe even should, like just something as simple as humble random list. Not that we have had some, but not that many. But I'm meaning like a random list generator in a game where you go to a place and then you randomly generate from atmospheric words some words to it. That's a generator, and I think adding it kind of gives a little bit towards the character of this perspective of generators. So, like, putting this all together, that if you're thinking, okay, these paradigms kind of shift my position a bit, like rights become more like these sort of Lego pieces, and the roles kind of break the traditional concept of identity more into this sort of operative forms that can be designed. Like, if I'm an impressionist, I go there into this role of an impressionist, like it was a suit that I put on. Or like if we think of the tests a couple of weeks ago where we had the combiner, but like the nature of the roles being designable as kind of permutators for you, like modifiers for yourself, is an interesting possibility, and capturing and saving and so on and so forth. So if you kind of have that like as a way of shifting from normal senses, then you go like with that kind of like understanding to these structures, like, okay, we use OBOK, but then like, for example, to fill a scene in an OBOK, you could also say, okay, we use the shift engine, or we put the whole organization into the sort of or a certain project into Imagus engine, and kind of utilize it to kind of analyze things that are there, but also like define things that are there. It's more like a toolkit kind of direction, and it's almost more like a general map that has certain sense to it for how to map such a toolkit. And that's a kind of a direction I'm thinking in an early draft way, but I do think it also gives a certain kind of direction of a sensible picture of how you could have this sort of common game of organizations toolkit.
So, are you thinking with this toolkit idea, what's the best way to communicate this concepts, research, work, toolkit? Like, what's the best format to do it?
At least a good format.
What about a game in itself?
I think it would be like you could make this into a game. You could make it into a meta game or a toolkit, which is then playable.
Yeah, exactly.
And has playable calibrations. Like, you explain this sort of meta view, and then you say, okay, here's OBOK, and here's how you play it. but then it comes also with the sense of the meta view that, oh, it's not the only possibility.
Yeah.
And
Because I'm thinking it would be very interesting and I don't know, weird and meta to play the game where you come up with examples of roles or goals or
yeah,
organizational designs within the
yeah,
game. You sort of like explore the framework itself.
yeah,
Yes, and just sort of like these generative scenes could be created around forward thinking organizations, like maybe generative problems of distributed organizations that are
yeah,
building token stuff that is complex. Like that could be quite fun and interesting.
yeah. Like I'll actually write that down.
I
Game.
like that you said playable toolkit. I think that's
Yeah,
powerful.
I put that down as well.
Yeah, that you learn through playing, or that
Mhm,
concepts come to life in a playful way.
yeah,
I yeah, I also think that that is kind of a powerful idea, because learning by playing means that even if you don't actually reach something that you want to implement, you are still learning about the potential structures and organization ways of organizing. So
mm,
it's cool.
yeah. Can you repeat your very nicely put words? I was
I,
big.
I, I of course forgot everything I said.
I put learn through play, but you said it much better.
You said sort of like the concepts come to life through
Mm,
playing. In
yeah,
a, do you have the word in English? Ludic? This is not a word.
yeah,
Yes,
Yeah,
is
yeah,
it? Ah, okay, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Ludic understanding of the concepts, and yeah. I don't know. I was gonna say
yeah.
something else, but I forgot now.
Ludic approach. Let's call it. I'm making notes at the top, like which is kind of like a text box that aims to relate to the whole structure in itself. Like
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot of this recent, nah, maybe not so recent anymore, but in video games, this paradigm of just skipping at tutorials and
mm,
sort of like the mechanics of the game are levels
yeah,
where you're like basically they take you by the hand and you play the examples. Something like that could be interesting. Like there's entry level games, entry levels where you sorry, my mic went down. Where you learn through playing, and then you might the things you generate in that tutorial might be things you play at a later stage. Like
yeah,
maybe you play the roles you generated earlier, something like that. Like I'm thinking of steps, like how to step up in complexity.
yeah. Like I'm very much with you on that. Like in a way, like one of the things in the gyms was like how do you not don't have to give the rules. Like of course it might be beneficial that you have some explanation, but like the kinds of things could be understood just by seeing them and kind of what the heck is this and then figuring it out. Um, and that's not to say that having explanations is a bad thing. Like actually, like having discourse around it. Like, hey, here's a way how you can generate them, or here's how I read it, or here's what I generated from this gene is a good thing to happen. But it's not a requirement that you go and okay, I have to read the instructions first. Is a powerful approach in itself.
Yeah, and you can keep the instructions for the only the essential, which I
Yeah,
think it's a good exercise to just like keep it to the most fundamental part and then just play the rest.
agreed. Um, and I think it's a good design goal to have, like that you don't really need to instruct things. This also relates to what Mikael you were saying earlier about that when you were talking about the shift engine and Imagus engine, that they kind of explain themselves even with that. Like, of course, they can be more, but it's also kind of in them. It was a desire that there is some functionality even just by like the words themselves. Like back to this, like you can get more if you read more about them, but there is something you can do even just by seeing them. That's kind of the combination. I think a realistic combination that can exist. Like, I mean, there's some fanciness in the shift, like calling it shifts was the idea that the smallness, like really like one sentence is a worthwhile contribution if the general attitude is like then there can be another one from another player and another one from another player, and kind of encouraging that. But you could call it, of course, just a description. It's just trying to emphasize the smallness. And then the chisel was just a fancy kind of perspective towards it. It's like when a sculptor has this big block of stone, and what is it will turn into is this detailed sculpture. It's about this very small strikes, and which kind of every strike in a way adds a detail, which I've always liked as a kind of operation style. So yeah, that's why the chisel is there.
Okay, I had another comment relating, 5 minutes ago, you added that role of frameworker there, and I just started to think about, let's say, frames overlapping each other, and as just like a model, as a kind of just a conceptual way of thinking, and maybe also like representing. And I just made a small image. If you go to the left side of that paradigms and principles, I just draw something there. Yeah, there. Okay, just as one example, like structure, where every frame is interacting with two other frames as well. I just meant, now if I would call this, let's say, flower, then I would, after this, I would immediately know that, okay, I am talking about structure that is overlapping this way. If I would have many of these representations, let's say like 5 or 6, where one is just like a block after block and everyone is overlapping, or everyone is scattered, or everyone is very close to each other, or something like that, just as a kind of tool to think about different ways of organizing frames. In that case, if you would like to start from adding frames and only then adding like content and moving these frames and so on, but something as a design model where to start.
I think that is really good. I think there is actually a lot of practical sense. Like, I was kind of also like thinking the structures is like this sort of overlays, in the sense that you can put many they are still kind of like perspectives. Like, even if you're following them as rules, they're still kind of like perspectives, because you could shift to another, and then it's almost like a different language, and like now you would see things differently. But like how you're like thinking about describing it is really good. Can I actually move this? I would move it underneath the framework structures, because it's then like, because I really like it explaining it in the connection with the structures.
Definitely, yeah.
Just and I'm also kind of playing around trying to learn to be more mirror board capable, mirror board expressive, and like this, I think is an interesting possibility to try to think about how the space can be used, like so playing around with the spaces. But that to me is like a nice communication now that it's kind of the relation. Of course, one can even draw a relation. Let's put it here.
Oh yeah.
Doesn't have to be perfect, but it's there. But I think like this, how we're talking about it is going to a good direction. It's like all of these ideas already, like the Pablo's comment, like this as a toolkit, but more like a playable toolkit as a metagame, and that the approach is learn through play, and then like also like Mikael's last comment about like also how to explain this, like that the structure is not something that is like cast in stone. Like that's also why I call them structurers, like to make it active. It's not that it's cast in stone, but it's almost like calibration. It's like a configuration. Let's actually add these words because they are good. Calibrators, configurers, because that has the sense that the configuration could change, but that a particular configuration gives you a certain kind of sense. Now you see it this way, kind of thing. And now you operate it this way as well, not just passively, or not just observing, but also acting. But what do you think of the like general division or this perspectivization? Like it's new, so I'm not like thinking this is the best. But I thought there was something when I started thinking about it like this, and also this generators. Why you could easily say like, okay, every game is a generator. Why do you need it? But still, like there was something really interesting about this, like that you have like this sort of focus or highlight of the okay, this is almost like an output machine, like a horn, and this kind of sound comes out of it, and this is more like a violin. It generates different things, and like I think highlighting that made a kind of viewpoint which is I think useful and unusual in certainly in organizations, but maybe even in games.
I'm thinking this is type of like I'm thinking a lot about the best format in which this could be conveyed, because I definitely feel like the document format is not great. It's too linear. So I'm thinking, how could this be arranged in a more wiki or rhizomatic way in which you can sort of like, if you, for example, go into the frame page, what other elements is that related to? If you're inside the Imagus engine, how other elements are contextualized within it, sort of like a more dynamic relational approach to it. Maybe one starts like this titanic endeavor of writing something about each possible relation between elements. Maybe that's too much, I'm not sure. But yeah, sort of like a more layered, rhizomatic, relational approach to showing this information. Not sure what that means, but I would think that would greatly benefit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I added that to it's now at this top level as a general consideration. Like edit away if you think it's badly worded, but I think it's a very useful thing to like. One can kind of see it as like not a document, but if there is a metaphor of the paradigm of the page, and then the pages like has this like, oh, like here's essentially tag like relations,
Exactly.
and then you have maps, like which put the pages in different structures. Okay, let's add that as well because that's actually potential. Um, um,
Peko, I've seen you use Obsidian. Have
yeah.
you? I also use it, but have you read about logsec?
No, I don't think so.
Because I haven't got into it. It makes me confused, but I want to. And it's also like this in this realm of tools for thought.
Yeah.
And it has this structure of like things become sort of modules and you tag them. And then when you call a tag, you get a page assembled from all the elements that have that tag. Could be a way of making sense of this, but I'm not sure. Maybe not. I would have to know more about it.
How do you spell that? Is it like
I
log?
wrote it in the chat.
All right, I'll check it. Yeah, I have to check it because like I like Obsidian as an environment. It's mostly, I think, like many of the basic solutions in Obsidian are nice. Like, oh, that works in a sensible manner. It's a repeating factor with it. But there's also a lot of things that I think could be done in a different way. And also, I don't think there's one way. Like, it's definitely possible to like think other kinds of forms that work for other kinds of things. Yeah, so I have to check that out. Now I'm screen sharing, so I won't do it now. But like, but I do think like for later, I'll have to check that out. But I do think like looking at this different forms, like also for editing such. I haven't really played with it, but the fact that Obsidian has like every page is ultimately a web page if you create a visible vault, which makes it interesting potentially to edit, and that's one possibility to think about. That like actually Obsidian web pages are really interesting. Like um, I can post some links. Pablo probably has seen them, but Mikael maybe not, and probably would be interesting for you as well. Like because it's a very different sense of a web page. It's like and different from a normal wiki page, even though it has wiki elements in it. Uh, mm, yeah, but I think all of those directions are like like loosely speaking, like thinking about this, that there is this sort of modularity, whether that's literally a page, but something like this sort of like modularity is like allows things to kind of compound together, like all these things come together. But then it has this sort of relations. It's like, oh, this has this relation with that, a reference to this, but also like, okay, here's a map, which then says like we've got all these pages together and these pages together. So the pages are in a way floating, but then mapping can give them a structure, and not necessarily a serial order, but some kind of a clustering. And there can be many maps, of course. Then you have the modularity of mapping it in different ways, which I think is an interesting possibility and not even too difficult technologically speaking. But I think also like that it's a playable toolkit is a really interesting challenge. Like in a way, like I definitely can see how to do such a thing, but also there's probably better ways to do it. Like, and it's something that one could develop as it goes along. That there's like this, in a way, a design goal that is still a game. Like it kind of avoids to turn into conventions of toolkits. Like it kind of uh, like can utilize some of the principles, but then really also aims to be a game. Uh, yes, a game containing maybe other games, but also playable in itself.
I feel it's the only way. Like it's the only thing that makes sense. What if we write a book about this? No, it has to be a game.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And it's also like using the strengths, to be honest, because it's not just actually game design strengths, but the kind of approaches that we have been using are precisely for this very small, almost non-present approach to games, which is like the playfulness or gameability of elements that are often not considered games, which I think we have developed certain skills already, like along the process of this.
And it allows for very interesting forms of navigating the game or the document or however we want to call it. For example, I'm thinking of having either a more point and click approach where you choose your own adventure, kind of non-linear way of reading it, but there could also be randomized elements in it. Maybe you get to explore concepts by throwing a dice, and then you might go to a certain one and then jump to another one. We might even mix them. Like that could be interesting to have turns, if turns are a thing, but to have them with each with different way of navigating the thing itself, like as an exploration of that. Like I believe it can be very shape-shifting in a didactic way. Like that's what I'm getting to.
There is like the whole idea of turns, and I would put turns/moves. I'm writing this down on the it's kind of presentation. Let's put it's both playability and presentation now, this topic, but yeah, like the turns and moves, because there is this interesting quality about a move that it's almost like a dynamic turn. It can be in a more rigorous set turn order. Like first I do a move and then you do a move, and that's our turn order. But when you do a move, it's kind of like summoning a turn in a way, like softly speaking, oh, now I'm doing things, and others are waiting to see what's happening when I'm doing my move. And playing between this range, because sometimes it's actually good to have a turn order, like, or turn logic. Let's put turn logic, because turn logic is better than turn order, because it's saying that turns can have like a wider spectrum of structuring.
I feel turns, I don't know, you probably have given it more thought, but turns allow for having these parallel times. One of them where you have like game time. You could consider time only in a sense of when things change, when things move in a formal game manner, the moves that count for the game itself. Having this time where the game is taking place, while the space between the turns can become meta space of analyzing what has happened in game time, if that makes sense. Like maybe it's a useful way to organize this game because it allows for this change in layer.
That's a really good point, actually. Go ahead, Mika.
Like every turn is kind of you are in that same in the space of the same turn until there is this that they call in online games, like it ticks. There is a tick, and then it moves to the and everything is resolved, and then it moves to the other turn. But then let's say in card games, then there are also these like action type of moves or something like that that you can play whenever, and they are resolved immediately, like for instance.
Yeah, like, and by the way, Pablo, you just summoned or comprised one of the key arguments or one of the forgotten key concepts of Derrida, like why margins of philosophy is called margins. I actually call it, put the margin space here, is precisely this quality of like structuring, creating always unavoidably this meta space. It has other meanings, but this is the key one of the key points what he wants to bring out with this margin and the quality of extra space that it creates on meta space. But it's a very practical thing as well. Like you said, like I think that when you have turns, you have kind of created this meta space, and you're able to address it, like saying, "Oh, between the turns, we have this discussion." That's not even a hard thing to do because the space is there already waiting for you.
It also allows each turn to have a very different tone, a very different goal. Like each turn can even be like a unique game in itself with shifting rules. Again,
or a scene.
Or a scene, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I guess this is just thinking of turns as scenes.
Yeah,
and
it is a scene, yeah.
Yeah, and the space in between is a meta scene, I guess.
Yeah, like the scene, so there is a clear overlap between scene and a frame. This was actually one of the things I was thinking to point out that, oh, sorry, I'm mixing my terms and making a mess, between frame and a scene. So there's a clear relation, like in a way, like every scene created is a heavy use of framing, like and all the definitions of a scene. Say when we're playing the XORG, like saying we put these agencies and things like this. This is almost like painting the frame. And then there's this empty contour that has this painted frame around it, which has already shaped it. That's very much framing, but then the scene quality in it is it's almost like if there is a logic for the filling of the frame, like that it's not just fill whatever, but it's like, oh, we have this, like inside the scene, we have already said that you pick one role when you come to the scene, which means that there's a logic of what happens within when the scene is kind of filling or generating itself from this contour. This is more like the scene emphasis. But there's always a frame around the scene. It's always depending on the frame. And whenever you frame something, you create a potential for a scene. Okay, this also should be written down. But this is very much a important quality why also between these diagrammatic dungeons, why like thinking of this frames themselves, like it was just a kind of a different take on the scene. Like ultimately it was very much creating a similar space like the scene in the obok, but just with a different emphasis.
Oh, one other thing as well, it could also be seen as every turn to become a new version. And if you can access the version history, then you can actually do the same thing, kind of.
Yeah, that is true. And this is actually the idea in the version of approach in the imagus. Let's add that there. Frame, but I put the turn idea there as well. Can be considered version. Like everything can be considered a version when it creates a then it creates a duplicate of itself. And there is in the shift engine, this was approached by this branch. Like sometimes to explore this space, I have this annoying habit of like taking a different concept, mostly to emphasize something different. Like it would be useful to point out that these are actually kind of highly related things. like the version and the branch. But because the branching idea was, and I've tried, by the way, this a couple of days ago on the genes, and it works really well, which was this like an idea that you say, do I have anything open? Okay, let's see. This could work. It's a cool image. I've been collecting also interesting images. So this one I like a lot because there's so many possibilities. Like if you start thinking, like because of the slight absurdity, but yet something that is conventional, like you could say take it into so many directions. But like let's say as a branch, I say, like of course I could describe generally as like almost like set in stone, or something that we commonly agree upon is that this is a religion of this is a ritual of temper of fake burial, like in a way like the person is actually not covered over, but you go to this ritual, and then people like throw this whatever they are throwing on, and then you get up and then the ritual is over. But if I set it as a branch, now it's there waiting, and then somebody thinks, hey, that's interesting, and they can continue that branch, but it also kind of leaves open the door that maybe that's not, like there's a completely another route, that it's not a temporary burial, but somebody starts a branch where, no, it's actually they put the bomb in, and then the bomb will explode after a precise amount of time, like 10 years, or like, and then that's a very different branch, and somebody might pursue that. So like this is of course highly related to the sort of versionary nature of things, or it's the same thing with a slightly different emphasis. But it's a very useful mechanic for once again for these generative purposes of things. Yes, ramifications, forking. And yes, it relates to this saving and capturing. Let's put that down. Also here, what's happening? No. Okay, let's put branching ramifications into that concept, and versions as different different takes on that. But yeah, like it's useful in many places, but like having these sort of structures in mind, like for example, that generators have this particular quality that they, for example, address branching, is that when you go to something like genes, like I didn't start from empty when I started thinking about them. Like I already had like from tarots this addressing of versions, and from the shift, the branching. So I was just kind of taking it off the shelf and putting it there, and it works because there was this sort of understanding of a certain kind of generation, quality of generation, and this is also why these kind of things can be very useful, is because you kind of like taking this map and taking things that in this new context is probably going to be useful as a quality.
I will come back to general idea regarding how to play this meta game.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of I don't know, it's a very absolute idea, doesn't have to be this way, but just came to my mind. If there's 3 stages, where first stage is understanding the concepts through guided play, then there's a second stage where you generate new structures or versions of the concepts, and then a third stage where you play those concepts you came up with. So sort of like the end goal of the game is that you play a new game that did not exist at the beginning and that came up through the play itself.
Yeah, like understanding,
Generating
generating, and playing.
and playing.
And one thing I would add that these don't necessarily have to come in order. I mean, you need some understanding to start. So in a way, like understanding is almost like zero, but you don't need to understand everything. It's like you understand something and then you go. And like you could go from there to playing if there is, say, an example form, and then go like after playing, you're like, oh, now I understand this better. Therefore, I go now to generating. Uh,
Yeah, it's
uh,
like understanding is, as you say, a zero stage, and then generating and playing can be like a feedback loop.
Yeah, like, yeah, I don't think this understand this thing. No, it doesn't understand zero. Like, let's put
That's really bad.
yeah, that's the
Yeah.
yeah, that's what happens with these conventions. Like, this is, by the way, like in Obsidian, I sometimes have these fights because it follows these sort of conventions of what is a list, and like, in a way, I understand it. You have to program them, and like having too many options and behaviors also makes the interface harder. But like for example, saying like questions can be bullet points, which is a similar thing, which creates a whole like interesting quality. Like you have a list and some are immediately questions, then you have like a different kind of intelligibility of the thing.
Just one quick comment, just like about the kind of order of things. Yeah, I really think the same, that you can actually kind of choose how you want to approach. Would be quite a kind of fun sometimes to play with these three categories, so that okay, we only have them here like now, and then what we do is, let's say someone of us or all of us three, we can freely select what any, even if we own it or don't, let's say NFT avatar, and we only copy paste it, paste those three avatars here, and then we start to look at this, like, okay, do we want to take this like more of this like paradigms or structures or some sort of generative things, and how could we start building from there, just as a kind of very basic experiment. It would be fun.
Yeah, like let's imagine that, like since you have like a sense of that idea in your head, do you see any details? Like, how would you approach that? Like, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but like often when
Yeah.
you have it in your head, there is more. And so, like, how would you start it?
This is really interesting. I really don't know, because for me, kind of intuitively, there would be at least like two ways to start. Uh, uh, not through these, but like I would maybe make a selection that do I want to kind of uh, or kind of maybe some sort of like brainstorming, maybe even like, okay, what sort of like words might these characters be suggesting, or then what sort of roles or traits could they be suggesting, and even more, how do they seem to be relating to each other if they are from if they come from different collections. And that would be interesting, like, okay, these come from different collections, what might they have in common as well? This is like my intuitive thought.
Yeah, like, but this precisely places another point on this, why to put the generators in there, because brainstorming is a generator. Like, I mean, they're like loose brainstorming, but then there are all these like, here's the rules for brainstorming kind of thing. But in a way, like you could do, of course, brainstorming even with the, say, this shift engine. Not that it's exactly made for that, but it's pointing out that you could make generators that are alternatives to normal brainstorming, and then they create differences. So you could, in a way, like for your situation, one possibility is to pick up a generator that is made for that kind of a situation, something that is not yet probably on the list, but um, uh, towards the more brainstormy side of things, like, and I definitely can think of such. It's actually something I've thought about a bit, like, is to how to have like different mechanics for things that are more in the family of brainstorming like things.
Yeah, something to there is already the description, for instance, but something also to create shared space between objects, maybe.
Yeah, that is that's actually kind of, let's put that, shared space, shared relations. Generator, like, that would be a useful generator. That's um, that's like, if one thinks about this game in itself, if there would be such a thing, it would be a useful generator, because it's like a tool. It's an instrument. Generator is an instrument in a way. Like, and I do think, like, I think one can definitely make such things. Like, if I'm roughly thinking, like, I would start like from the concept of a relation, then like the relations in and of themselves create a space. Like, if you have multiple relations, it's a kind of space in and of itself. But like, if you could, and it's also a relation to create, say, a category. That if you say these are all characters, that is creating a relation to something yet undefined context in itself. But it's presetting a relation, or predefining something of a relation. And then somebody could add to that, which is they can move. And it's uncertain what that means. It's just they can move. And this is another can of worms. Let's not open that too much, but there is a lot one can do when you're playing with uncertainty. Like, it's actually a really interesting addition in this kind of structures, that you say, like, these are characters, and you don't know what that means, but it means something. And then you say they can move, but you don't know exactly how they move, but you're interested in the direction of moving. But you stop there. You don't want to define what the moving means. Rather, you leave it for the rest of the process to define it.
Something relating to language just came to my mind also, like, okay, we have these objects and or characters, and then these characters kind of have these, let's say, roles, abilities, accesses to objects, and so on. They are either like easily shared, or they are hard to share. And then, like, also, like, how can this other character access to these that this other contains, or masters, or something like that. I don't know, or developing some sort of like shared language. Okay, kind of a little like in Fiasco or something, like, okay, these are connections between these two, but they experience these placeholders or these words totally differently. I have to tell the kind of short expression of a story through the lens of this character, and then you have to tell through this character, and they may differ a lot, and there may be tensions or partnerships, or other kind of relations. I don't know, this is more narrative, but just like there might, and what all that you described earlier, there really might be like many ways to kind of kind of look at these relations.
Yeah, and it's also what opens up from there, like using Fiasco as a sort of an example, but so like it names these things characters, but then that allows it to add more details to the characters, that every character has this and that and this. I cannot remember exactly what they have, but like they become diverse from each other, but sharing certain attributes, I guess you could call them. And it's a kind of a powerful general thing. Like, and this relates to this sort of just naming these characters, kind of like categorizing in a way. That once you have the categorization, you have this possibility of let's put that in its own. I'm writing this to the presentation. They might have a better place, but categorization as grouping, and group diversification is a term I could make up here. By what I mean is
essentially also what Fiasco does, it creates a kind of short, very stripped network between these characters, kind of.
Yeah, but it does that by kind of grouping them as characters, then creating group diversification, which is that everybody has this, like relations, but then everybody's relation is different, which makes them, this is what I meant by group diversification, or let's put it grouped in that. Grouped diversification is that, so characters have relations, all of them, but all of their relations are different. So they're grouped by the fact that they are of a similar type, and this type called character contains relations, but each instance of that type has different relations. And this is a diversification, or also / individualization. And like these are very kind of like archetypical mechanics, because you could go through many other games, other structures as well, and notice similar qualities in itself. But it's a very useful thing to look at them also on the sort of high archetypical level, like that they start from kind of creating a category, like allowing for detailing. Let's put, I'm making really bad notes, but let's put group detailing, which is kind of creating a group type in the sense of structural term of the type. Group type. And then there's group diversification, individualization, which is variation in shared details. So that's
sorry.
Do say.
Oh, it's just like a short remark that this kind of diversification, and also it's almost like using kind of this sort of like artificial intelligence or something like that. Like, you know, I mean, like you take this and this and this, and then you use them in order to create a set of like new kind of, or you create the possibility to create unlimited amount of like characters kind of under these restrictions or so on. You kind of create the possibility to create collection on top of like kind of classifying the relations between these objects and building from there, kind of.
I agree. Like, this is the power of a type structure is precisely this, like the like in a way, like categorization is an interesting perspective towards this sort of collections or groupings, and in this way of like it's possible to create types by detailing whatever is categorized, and then it's possible to create a local variety by saying that these details that are added to the type can vary. Like this character, both these are three characters, all have relations. Each one has different relations. Like all have relations, but each one has different details on their relations. So that's local variety. It's variety on the character, and it's variety on even the relations of the character. And like said, this is very archetypical, like for game design, and very, very useful. And I think too rarely looked at in this kind of general level. Which is also why creating this sort of categories can be so useful in terms of like the earlier example of the 3 NFT pictures, and then they're all characters, and you have created this sort of uncertain category, like you don't know what's in there, but you have said that they are a category, and somebody else adds there, like they can all move, and then that creates this detail in which types them, and then somebody can come up at that, like they have this sort of description called move, and then somebody moves like 3 spaces like a board game, and other one moves is select a spot that where they feel that they are at that moment. And now we have, like, once again, local variety, that they all move, but they move differently. Of course, they could move in the same fashion as well. That's a possibility as well.
It's kind of I became somewhat interested in this sort of like in the kind of ability to which is very common, but like the possibility to kind of take whatever you want, and then having some generative mechanisms to use to kind of breed those elements, and then create new versions, kind of or new generations. So even so, kind of that you don't need the originals anymore. You kind of creating new characters that you can little like snake creating a new skin or something like that, or some sort of chameleon type of thing. But like so there is a metamorphosis, but it's not complete, but it's like one generation after another, and on top of that, like creating the possibility of like creating multiple kind of new variants.
Yeah, this is actually kind of a related archetype, and a very useful one as well. Like in the role-playing culture in the last decade, maybe, it has kind of formulated under the concept of skinning. So like skinning is definitely a version of this, which is like okay, we have this, say, character mechanics or being mechanics, but then I can always like say, like, take this particular set of mechanics and skin it as a bear, or as I don't know, something else, like some fantastical creature, but I'm just changing the skin on the top. But you can use it the other way around, which is like you said, like you have this raw material, and then you start adding this, say, mechanics or whatever, but then those actually become maybe even more important than the what was the material you started with. So let's actually put a note on this, like these have to be maybe written out or written. So I would call that like that there is like a top-down and a bottom-up approach to skinning, meaning like if you start with the image, and then you start adding on top, that's kind of like bottom-up, but then you can already have like ready mechanics, and then you put the skin of a bear on top. That's top-down in a way, like and like both are useful and used. Actually, the skinning, how it's used in role-playing, only contains the top-down. Like they don't think about the bottom-up. But this is why this is useful to find these archetypes. Like I kept thinking about this sort of categorization, group detailing, local variation, and kind of in my head quickly made an analysis of, say, chess. Like in a way, chess makes a category of a piece, and each piece has the detail of the move, but then it's the variation of the move that makes the chess pieces different. Whereas the eating, or whatever one calls like destroying the other piece, is actually the same in terms of the logic. It's just a move, because then like the pattern is always, if you land on the spot that where a piece exists, it will be eaten. Like it's the move variation and that makes this local diversity. And most of the chess is actually there. Like, and then there is the board, which you can define a bit, but you already have most of chess's definition from that, and then you can define the winning conditions. And like the checkmates and checks are a little bit of a like a complexity of its own on the side of it, but nevertheless, like it's really about this local diversity of moves for this category of pieces that creates most of chess.
When you see it that way, it becomes very evident how fast you can come up with variations for the game, right? Like if you're just like, okay, the win condition is to eat all of them. What's the name of the pawns? Yeah, eat all of the pawns. It's already a different game, right?
Yeah. And also, like, of course, you can see like you can create other moves, but also like you could like make a different varying category. That if you, for example, start introducing variety to eating, that you make detail to them, which is like eating pieces, and then like if like some pieces eat the piece if they hit it 2 times.
Yeah.
You have a very different game. Like then, like it's like if they hit it once, they return to the spot where they started. But if they hit it twice, then they eat it. Whereas some pieces eat them by one go. And,
a health bar.
Yeah. It is a replication of a health bar kind of thing, or a weaker strike, stronger strike kind of thing.
There is a very old computer game called Archon and Archon 2, and this they were for Amiga 500 and maybe Commodore 64 as well.
Yes.
Yeah, and there they had hit points. So every time you should be eating someone or you are kind of threatening some piece, then there is another scene where you will fight, and of course the queen will have lots more hit points and better weapons. But it was kind of cool.
Yeah, Archon is a really good game. Like I played even the 64 version and even downloaded it later when somebody made a copy and played it through an emulator because it's still a good game. And it's like precisely it's based on this sort of like the basic scene being set chess-like very much. Like there's some variants, but it's very much in a chess-like. But just like Mikael says, if you land on the other piece rather than eating it, it spawns another scene, which is actually like a 2D field format where the characters can move and shoot or strike each other with health bars. And the game is completely different by that fact that the eating rather than being, oh, you're eaten, it's spawned this scene with a different interaction. And that in itself, because it's changing such a kind of key point, it creates a different game. And like we talked about just a moment ago, this is why this kind of typical viewpoints are so useful, is because they kind of take you into the space where you can see, okay, what if we vary this? What if we vary that? Like, what if we vary eating? Or like Archon is an example of this, just as well as Two Strikes kind of model is a very local variation on that.
Hey, actually, that brings me my mind that is a kind of cool feature that is hard to replicate in the real world, but maybe in the organizational way, that okay, now there is some trigger, let's say word or topic or something, that automatically we agree that automatically it triggers a new scene that is kind of not related to real world, but maybe conversational scene or something, but it really just like pops up, and then it vanishes when some condition is met.
Yeah, this is another archetype. I will actually now make a new. Where do I put it? I put it in the beginning. Like because in the representation it was overloaded by things that are more than representation. It was becoming big, so I make it in the beginning, like before the third, like the three things. I make. I'll just name it mechanics for now. Maybe there's a better name, but mix. So because like this is where now the skinning and templating and but let's put that conditions triggers. So condition trigger analysis is a thing that I do a lot, and condition trigger definition also. Because you can do a lot with just thinking about those structures, like what triggers something, and then what happens. Let's put those basics down. What triggers and what happens. So what is the logic followed? So this was actually one of my discoveries when I was looking at like what kind of game mechanics can cover essentially like the interactions in an economy that we would expect. Like what kind of mechanical archetypes would we expect? And I looked towards role-playing games partly because the kind of requirements were sort of similar. That there was a high overlap, not complete, but high overlap between the requirements. And the high overlap was because in a role-playing game, your character can say, I'll sit on the ground for 3 hours and look at the rocks. And that should be possible on the kind of desired principle, like that should be, okay, fine. It's a problem maybe for the other characters, but you should be able to do that. Or I start singing a song and so on. And this is an overlap with what we expect from organizations and economies, because you're looking at like how to create game mechanics which still feel like a game, but create this sort of expressive space in itself, like and not just expression, but also action. And then the question is, okay, how do they do that? Like, how do these role-playing games as mechanics do this thing? And the key thing actually is that you have a lot of floating logics, which is my name. It's an unexisting term, but it's a term I use. It's floating logic, which function by conditions and triggers. Like, for example, take a D&D, for example. Is like, it's a trigger that takes this floating combat logic, which is floating in the air, but with certain triggers, the combat logic is triggered. And when it's triggered, there comes like actually a very strict sequence. It's like, now we roll for initiative. Then by the initiative order, each character slash creature selects their actions from certain capabilities that they have with some amount of freedom. And after that has been resolved, we move into the next of the initiative and so on and so forth. So that trigger is actually kind of moving into a completely different space, just like the Archon example. It's a different scene. The combat sequence is a different scene where there is a different solving mechanics. And when the sequence kind of ends, which it has different ending conditions, which have some interpretation, but generally, for example, when the creatures die away, then the combat sequence is released to float again. And we're out of that scene. So, and once you approach it this way, like then you can go through, well, I use D&D, but I can look at almost any role-playing game, and they have application of the same pattern with variations of what is the triggering, what is the sequence, but it's always this floating mechanics and conditions slash triggers that is a key thing to allow for high flexibility of a default space, and then mechanical space by triggers, which then introduce the mechanics that can be much more strict. And it's a very, very flexible design space, that.
This reminds me a lot of video essay I watched. I'm gonna share it in the chat. About genre in video games, and how like most video game genre is defined by the mechanics. Like you have first person shooter, puzzle game, whatever. But then there's adventure games that they do not define the mechanics in the name of the genre. And how the mechanics are in service of the storyline, in service of the narrative, and they change throughout the game, right? So you have like, if you have an RPG, you have the world map, top-down view, then there's an encounter, and then you're in a fight, and that has a different set of mechanics. You could even say that inventory management is its own puzzle game, right? So maybe the game we make has to have this notion of shifting mechanics, like mechanics at the service of the game itself. So maybe it's an adventure game.
Okay, this is a kind of worms because I could nerd out about this. But it like the path, I agree with that. I might have actually seen the video. By the way, for this session, I will save the chat because there's many good links, and I won't check them now because I'm sharing the screen. But I will save the chat and post it to Telegram. But yeah, so the pathway of how adventure games develop is that because the role-playing games came first, that they are kind of in the 70s. And there was this high desire of taking those games, the pen and paper role-playing games, into the computerized space. And like adventure games in and of themselves have also other sources, but they connect to this paradigm, like, how do we do this? Because you couldn't quite implement the floating mechanics as purely as you can do in the high interpretation space of the role-playing games, because they are relying on the game master / referee being a general interpreter. Like then when you say, like, I'm sitting on the ground for 3 hours, it's fine. Whereas you cannot create that pure condition in a computer. You can sit on the ground, but you cannot, for example, examine rocks. But in the role-playing game, you can. So you can create pure floating mechanics and conditions in those. So what you see in adventure games, and certainly computerized role-playing games, is pseudo that. And this is also why precisely what you described fits here. It's like, okay, we cannot create this free condition, so we are creating like still a default form where there's openings, but then those trigger into these mini games themselves. Like you can think of the D&D combat as a mini game in itself, and it's very much, it's like even the pen and paper, like it triggers this logic and you're playing a different game. But here you kind of have to do that, but you're kind of creating a facsimile of this default space plus these additional spaces, but it cannot be this pure version in itself. But to your final comment, maybe we need those kind of mechanics. I think like this, touching upon this kind of approach, the conditions, triggers, I think it's very important to keep in the toolbox. It's very likely that you hit there many, many times because it has so much flexibility in itself. And immediately when you start talking about organizations and even economy, you're introducing a lot of situations which are back to this human element and actually kind of emphasizing the interpreter. Like, for example, if you're made an offer, even like, do you buy this toy? You're back to pure interpretation, because you could say, no, I won't, or yes, I will, or I will haggle, or I will just say it's too much. Or the person made the offer can be in this pure space, which then allows for conditional triggers as well, etc., and so on. So it's a very useful thing in this. And now I'll put a stop on this nerdy. Actually, too little analyzed. I cannot point you to a book that would write this clearly, and it's so important. So important to have this sort of sense that, like, actually, yes, there are conditions and triggers, but what is the behavioral capability around behavior, conditions and triggers? And that is the key thing that actually has had a lot of influence on game design, and it's where it reaches and where it doesn't reach.
I will have to leave in maybe 1 minute or so. I would like to stay here, let's say 2 more hours.
But hey, let's make a summary, because Pablo has to leave, and we have had a long session, but I would say it's a session that has been actually really good.
Yes.
Also, and I think
Agree.
actually we made a lot of what one could call progress, because like this, like raw frameworker, what I kind of put on the table has sophisticated itself a lot, and also brought out a lot of useful considerations and useful details that kind of develop or kind of start to furnish the space of and open up like how to consider this kind of direction in general. And I think it's definitely worth thinking about and visiting, because I think the potential that we're touching on is quite interesting in itself. And bonus points that we are so much in agreement. I think it's spontaneous agreement, but I do think like generally what everybody was bringing on the table was just like general honest agreement on things.
Yeah, high resonance.
Yes.
Yes.
So I would say let's all think about this. I will post a chat with the video, but then think about where we could take these ideas. I can already see that there is a certain cohesion to them, certainly. But like new ideas can be born in an after process, and we can go from there. But for the next session, I would at least introduce this. Like, I mean, people can watch the video, but like for others, I would introduce some of the thoughts that came from here for others.
That's great. Yeah, really looking forward to continue somewhere around here next time or very soon.
Yeah, I think there is something that is like we have made these diversifications, which has been useful. Like, for example, GEMS or the diagrammatic approach, they kind of emphasize different things and brought out different highlights. But this is kind of like maybe now also bringing certain cohesion. Like, okay, there were these branches and they brought out new notions, but there is a kind of like way to incorporate those new notions into the structures that already exist and kind of look at them together. And that's kind of where we ended up in this session, which I think is very useful in terms of creating a more sophisticated sense of what this is and what could be built out of it. Any last comments?
Not really. I will have to rewatch this session. I think there's a lot of mining that can be done.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really cool session. Yeah, liked it a lot. Yeah.
Yes. As I will stop